The thing about orphans on the American frontier that most people misunderstand is this. An orphan was not merely a child without parents. An orphan was a problem to be disposed of, a burden to be shifted, a mouth that consumed resources without producing anything in return. The romanticized stories of frontier communities taking in their own, of neighbors caring for neighbors' children as if they were blood, those stories existed because they were exceptional, because they stood out against the more common reality of orphans being sent to distant relatives who did not want them, placed with families who needed cheap labor more than they offered love, or simply turned out to fend for themselves when no one could be convinced to take responsibility. In the settlement of Millbrook, Nebraska, in the autumn of 1883, Nora Selby became an orphan at the age of 13 when both her parents died of scarlet fever within 4 days of each other. Her father went first, on a Tuesday. Her mother, weakened by nursing him and already showing symptoms herself, followed on Saturday. Nora had watched them both die, had held her mother's hand as the fever took her, had closed her mother's eyes when the breathing stopped. She was alone in the house with 2 bodies and no idea what to do next. The neighbors came, eventually. They buried the bodies in the small cemetery on the hill. They cleared out the house, taking anything of value as compensation for their trouble. They held a meeting at the church to decide what to do with the girl. And at that meeting, led by Prudence Whitfield, whose husband owned the general store and whose opinions carried the weight of wealth and social position, the women of Millbrook decided that no family would take the orphan in. The reasons given were practical, or at least they sounded practical. The fever might still be contagious. The girl had always been odd, prone to wandering alone and talking to herself. She had no useful skills that would compensate for the burden of feeding and housing her. She was 13, old enough to work, but young enough to require supervision, the worst possible age for an unwanted child. No family stepped forward to claim her, and no one was willing to force any family to accept what no one wanted. The decision, never formally announced but universally understood, was that Nora Selby would have to take care of herself. The town would not actively drive her out. They would simply not take her in. If she survived, well, that was her business. If she did not, that was also her business. The people of Millbrook had their own families to worry about, their own children to feed, their own problems to solve. One orphan girl was not their responsibility. Nora understood this decision better than the adults who made it realized. She had always been observant, had always noticed things that others overlooked, had always understood the unspoken currents beneath the surface of polite conversation. She knew that Prudence Whitfield had never liked her mother because her mother had been prettier and more popular. She knew that the other families saw her as a burden rather than a blessing. She knew that her survival depended entirely on herself because no one else would lift a finger to help her. She was 13 years old, alone, with winter coming and no home to shelter in because the house her parents had built had been claimed by the bank for unpaid debts. She had the clothes on her back, a small bundle of belongings that the neighbors had not thought worth taking, and a piece of land on the edge of town that her father had claimed but never built on, a south-facing hillside that everyone said was unsuitable for farming because the slope was too steep and the soil too thin. That hillside would save her life. It would save 60 other lives too, but that would come later. If you want to understand how a 13-year-old orphan girl transformed a hillside that everyone called her grave into a shelter that saved an entire settlement from the deadliest blizzard in Nebraska history, Subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. The first winter was about survival. Nora had no money to buy lumber, no tools to build a proper house, no skills beyond what she had learned helping her parents with household tasks. But she had watched her father work, had helped him dig the root cellar behind their house, had listened when he explained how the earth stayed warm in winter and cool in summer, because the temperature underground did not change with the seasons. Her father had been a thoughtful man, a reader of books when books were available, a man who understood principles even when he could not afford to apply them. He had talked about building an earth-sheltered house someday, a house that would use the hillside instead of fighting it, a house that would stay warm with less fuel because the earth itself would provide insulation. He had died before he could build it. Nora would build it for him. She began digging in October before the ground froze. She had no shovel, so she used a flat stone tied to a stick with strips of cloth. She had no pick, so she used a pointed rock as a crude chisel. She dug into the south face of the hillside, creating a hole that was perhaps 4 feet deep and 6 feet wide by the time the first snow fell. It was not a house. It was barely a burrow. But she lined the floor with dry grass, hung a blanket across the entrance, and survived the first night underground with a small fire that she fed with twigs and dried weeds. The smoke was terrible. She had not created a chimney, had not understood how to vent the fire properly, and she spent that first night coughing and crying and wondering if she would suffocate before morning. But she did not suffocate. She did not freeze. She woke to a world covered in snow and crawled out of her burrow and realized that she had survived something that should have killed her, and that if she could survive one night, she could survive another and another until she had survived enough nights to call it a life. The people of Millbrook saw her that winter, occasionally, when she came to the edge of town to scavenge food from their trash heaps or to trade small services for scraps. They saw the dirt on her clothes, the hollow cheeks, the haunted eyes of a child living like an animal in a hole in the ground. Some of them felt guilty. Most of them simply looked away. Prudence Whitfield, passing by in her husband's wagon, commented loudly that the girl was digging her own grave on that hillside and would probably be in it by spring. The comment was repeated. It spread. By January, everyone in Millbrook referred to Nora's shelter as the grave. They did not mean it kindly. The first year ended. Nora survived. The grave grew. Through the spring and summer of 1884, Nora expanded her shelter from a burrow into something that resembled a room. She dug deeper into the hillside, creating a space that was 8 feet deep and 10 feet wide and tall enough to stand in. She lined the walls with stones that she gathered from the creek bed and fitted together without mortar, creating a surface that held back the earth and would not collapse. She built a proper fireplace, a stone structure that vented smoke through a chimney that rose through the hillside and emerged above, looking like nothing more than a natural crack in the rock. She laid a floor of flat stones, then covered it with packed clay, then covered that with salvaged boards from a collapsed barn on an abandoned homestead. She built a door from the same salvaged lumber, hung it on leather hinges, and sealed the gaps with mud and grass. By October of 1884, Nora had a home. It was crude, it was small, it smelled of earth and smoke and the accumulated residue of a year of desperate survival. But it was warm. The temperature inside the grave, even before she lit a fire, was approximately 50 degrees. the constant temperature of the earth that surrounded it on 3 sides and above. With a small fire burning, the temperature rose to the low 60s, comfortable enough for light indoor clothing, while the world outside dropped to 20 below zero. She needed perhaps a quarter of the firewood that a proper wooden house would require, which was fortunate because she had no way to transport large quantities of wood and had to gather fallen branches by hand. The second year was about improvement. Nora expanded the grave again, digging a second chamber behind the first that served as a sleeping alcove. She dug a root cellar that branched off from the main room, a cold storage space that stayed at 40 degrees year-round, perfect for keeping vegetables and preserved food. She built a chicken coop into the hillside beside the main entrance, a small earth-sheltered structure that kept her 3 chickens warm enough to lay through the winter when other settlers' chickens stopped producing entirely. She learned to trap rabbits and tan hides. She learned to gather and dry wild plants. She learned to trade her small surpluses, eggs and pelts and dried herbs, for the tools and supplies she could not make herself. The people of Millbrook still called it the grave. They still expected her to die. But she did not die. She grew stronger. Her shelter grew larger, and year by year, the grave became something that no one in Millbrook had ever seen before, something that the settlement could not understand because they had never encountered anyone who built this way. The third year brought the first crisis. A prairie fire swept through the area in late summer, burning the dry grass and threatening every wooden structure in its path. The settlers of Millbrook fought the fire with buckets and wet blankets and prayer, and they saved most of their buildings, but 3 houses and 2 barns were lost, along with the stored food and supplies they contained. Nora watched the fire approach her hillside and did nothing. She walked inside her shelter, closed the door, and waited. The fire passed over her roof, burning the grass on the hillside above, and did not touch anything else. The earth protected her. The stone walls did not burn. The sod roof, covered with 3 feet of soil, did not ignite. When she emerged the next morning, the world around her was black and smoking, but her home was untouched. Some of the settlers noticed. A few of them wondered if perhaps the orphan girl had built something more clever than they had assumed. But no one said anything to her directly, and the moment of curiosity passed, and Millbrook went back to calling her shelter a grave and expecting her to die in it. The 4th year brought expansion beyond necessity. Nora had survived. She had proven to herself that she could survive. Now she began to think about what else was possible. She dug a 3rd chamber, larger than the first 2 combined, a great room that was 20 feet wide and 30 feet deep, with a ceiling supported by timber beams that she traded an entire winter's worth of pelts to acquire. She built alcoves into the walls, sleeping niches that could hold 4 or 5 people each, carved into the earth and lined with stone. She installed a second fireplace at the far end of the great room, vented through a chimney that emerged 50 feet from the first. She did not know why she was building so large. She had no family, no friends, no one who would share the space with her. But something drove her to keep digging, to keep expanding, to create a shelter that was far bigger than one person needed. Perhaps it was the memory of her parents, who had dreamed of a large family and a prosperous homestead, and had died before they could achieve either. Perhaps it was the loneliness, the desperate hope that if she built something large enough, someone would eventually want to share it. Perhaps it was simply the satisfaction of creating, of transforming a hillside that everyone called a grave into something that proved she was alive. The 5th year brought refinement. Nora improved everything she had built, adding details that made the grave more comfortable and more efficient. She dug drainage channels that prevented water from seeping through the walls during heavy rain. She added a ventilation system, small shafts that brought fresh air into the chambers and carried stale air out. She built furniture, rough but functional, benches and tables and bed frames that she carved from salvaged wood. She accumulated supplies, preserved food and firewood, and blankets and tools, far more than she could use herself, but satisfying to have. A hedge against disaster that might never come. By the autumn of 1887, Nora Selby was 18 years old. She had lived alone in her earth-sheltered complex for 5 years. She had not spoken to anyone from Millbrook in months, trading only with travelers passing through who did not know her history and treated her as simply a young woman with goods to sell. She was strong, capable, self-sufficient, and completely alone. The people of Millbrook had mostly forgotten about her. A few remembered the orphan who had dug a grave in the hillside. Fewer still wondered if she was alive. Prudence Whitfield, when the subject came up at all, assured everyone that the girl had surely died years ago, that no one could survive living like an animal in a hole in the ground, that it was God's will and not their fault. Then came January 12th, 1888. The morning of January 12th was unseasonably warm, temperatures rising into the 30s and even 40s across Nebraska and the Dakota territories. Settlers who had been confined to their homes by weeks of bitter cold emerged to enjoy the mild weather, to tend to chores that had been neglected, to send their children to school because the weather was finally safe for travel. The schoolhouses across the region filled with children that morning. The farms emptied of workers who finally had a chance to repair fences and tend livestock. The settlements breathed a collective sigh of relief that the worst of winter seemed to be over. The storm hit in the early afternoon. It came without warning, a wall of ice and snow that descended from the northwest with a speed and violence that no one had ever experienced. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in minutes. The visibility dropped to zero as the snow came horizontally, driven by winds that exceeded 60 miles per hour. People who were caught outside could not see their own hands in front of their faces. They could not hear each other shouting from 10 feet away. They could not find shelter that was right beside them, because the world had become a featureless white void that swallowed everything. The schoolhouse blizzard, as it would come to be known, killed over 200 people across Nebraska, South Dakota, and the surrounding territories. Many of them were children who had walked to school that morning and could not find their way home. Many of them were adults who had gone out to tend livestock and froze to death within sight of their own houses. Many of them were families trapped in homes that could not hold heat against the wind, their fires going out, their walls letting in drafts that dropped the indoor temperature to fatal levels. In Millbrook, the wooden houses that had been built for ordinary winters discovered that this was not an ordinary winter. The wind found every gap, every crack, every poorly sealed joint. The cold penetrated walls that had seemed solid, floors that had seemed insulated, roofs that had seemed tight. The fires that had kept families comfortable in normal cold could not keep pace with the heat loss that the blizzard caused. The temperature inside the houses dropped and kept dropping. People piled on every blanket they owned and still shivered. Children huddled around stoves that glowed red hot and still cried from the cold. And the fuel began to run out because no one had prepared for a storm this severe, because no one had stockpiled enough wood or coal, to keep a fire burning hot enough to fight winds that seemed designed to steal every calorie of heat as fast as it could be produced. The first families to flee did so within hours of the storm's arrival. They could not stay in houses that were killing them. They had to find shelter somewhere else, anywhere else, any place that was warmer than the wooden boxes that were bleeding heat into the wind. Someone remembered the grave. Someone remembered the orphan girl who had dug into the hillside 5 years ago, who might or might not still be alive, whose shelter was built into the earth rather than exposed to the wind. Someone suggested that if the grave still existed, if anyone was still there, it might be warmer than the houses that were failing. The first group arrived at Nora's door just before dusk. There were 7 of them, the Perkins family, parents, and 5 children, all of them frostbitten and terrified, and barely able to walk the half-mile from town through snow that was already waist-deep. Nora opened her door to find them huddled on her threshold, the father's face white with the early stages of frostbite, the mother clutching an infant that had stopped crying because it was too cold to cry. She did not ask questions. She did not demand explanations. She simply stepped aside and let them in. The Perkins family entered the grave and stopped in the doorway, staring at what they saw. A great room, warm and dry, lit by oil lamps and a fire that burned steadily in a stone fireplace. Stone walls that radiated the steady temperature of the earth. A ceiling of timber beams that showed no frost, no condensation, no sign that the apocalyptic cold outside had any power here. The temperature inside was 54 degrees, not warm by ordinary standards, but after the killing cold they had fled, it felt like summer. The mother began to cry. The father said nothing, only guided his family to the fire and knelt beside it, holding his hands to the heat as if he could not believe it was real. The children stared at Nora with eyes that did not understand how a person could live in the ground and not be dead. More families came. The Hendersons arrived an hour after the Perkins, 8 people in a group that had grown as they traveled, picking up neighbors who had abandoned their homes and joined the exodus to the grave. The Marshalls came next, then the Grimes family, then people whose names Nora did not know, strangers who had heard somehow that there was warmth in the hillside and had come seeking it the way dying animals seek water. By midnight, there were 34 people in Nora's shelter. By dawn, there were 47. By noon of the second day, when the storm finally began to weaken, there were 63. 63 people packed into a space that Nora had built for no one but herself, kept alive by the earth that surrounded them, and the fires that Nora fed with wood she had stockpiled for 5 years against a disaster she had never consciously anticipated. The logistics should have been impossible. 63 people need water, food, sanitation, air. Nora's supplies, though extensive for one person, should have been exhausted within hours. But something happened that Nora had not expected. The people she saved began to help. Thomas Perkins organized the adults into work parties, melting snow for water, rationing the food supplies, maintaining the fires. Martha Henderson took charge of the children, keeping them calm and quiet and out of the way. Samuel Grimes, who had carpentry skills, reinforced the ventilation shafts that Nora had built, ensuring that the air stayed fresh despite the crowding. They worked together, the community that had abandoned Nora 5 years ago, united now by the shared crisis of survival, contributing what they could to the effort that was keeping them all alive. Nora did not speak much. She moved through her shelter like a ghost, adding wood to the fires, checking the structural integrity of the walls, making adjustments to the ventilation. She had not spoken to most of these people since her parents' funeral. She had not been inside any of their homes, had not shared any of their meals, had not participated in any of their community events. They had left her to die, and now they were in her home, dependent on her for survival, and she did not know how to feel about that. The storm broke on the afternoon of January 13th. The wind died. The snow stopped. The temperature began to rise, slowly, toward levels that were merely brutal rather than lethal. The refugees emerged from the grave, blinking in the sudden brightness, staring at a world that had been transformed into a white wilderness where nothing moved and nothing was recognizable. The death toll in Millbrook was 11. 11 people who had not made it to the grave, who had frozen in their homes or while trying to reach shelter, who had died because they had built houses that could not protect them from a storm that their houses were never designed to survive. 11 people out of a settlement of nearly 100. In other communities, the death toll was much higher. Some settlements lost a quarter of their population. Some lost more. The schoolhouse blizzard killed indiscriminately, taking children and adults, rich and poor, prepared and unprepared. But in Millbrook, the death toll was limited by a grave that was not a grave, a shelter built by an orphan girl that everyone had expected to die 5 years ago, a hole in the ground that had saved 60 lives because the earth holds warmth that wooden walls cannot. The reckoning came 3 days later, when the roads were passable and the survivors could gather to account for what had happened. The meeting was held in the Millbrook Church, the same church where Prudence Whitfield had led the decision not to take in the orphan, the same church where Nora's parents had been eulogized before the community abandoned their daughter. Nora did not plan to attend. She had returned to her shelter after the storm, had begun the work of cleaning and restocking and repairing the small damage that 63 bodies had inflicted on her home. She was not part of Millbrook. She had not been part of Millbrook for 5 years. The crisis was over, and she saw no reason to pretend that the people who had saved themselves in her shelter owed her anything, or that she owed them anything in return. But Thomas Perkins came to her door. He came alone, hat in hand, and stood in the entrance to the grave that had saved his children and asked her, politely and humbly, if she would come to the church. "The people want to thank you," he said. "They want to apologize. They want to understand how you built this place and how it saved us when our houses almost killed us. I know we have no right to ask anything of you after what we did, but I am asking anyway. Will you come?" Nora looked at him for a long moment. She remembered Thomas Perkins from her childhood. He had been a friend of her father. He had attended her parents' funeral. He had not spoken up when Prudence Whitfield convinced the community to abandon her, had not offered to take her in, had not done anything to help her in the 5 years since. But he had been the first to reach her door during the storm. He had organized the refugees into a functioning group. He had thanked her quietly on the morning after the storm, when no one else was listening. She put on her coat and followed him to the church. The gathering was silent when she entered. 63 people, most of them, the ones who had survived in her shelter, plus the families of the 11 who had died, and a few others who had found shelter elsewhere. They turned to look at her, this young woman who had lived in the ground for 5 years, who had built something that none of them had understood, who had opened her door to them when she had every reason to let them freeze. Prudence Whitfield was there, sitting in the front pew, her face pale and her eyes fixed on the floor. She did not look at Nora. She had not looked at Nora since the storm ended. Her certainty that the orphan would die had been proven wrong, and wrong in a way that implicated her in every death that had occurred. Because if she had not convinced the community to abandon Nora, perhaps someone would have learned from Nora's building techniques. Perhaps someone would have built a shelter that could have saved the 11 who froze. Thomas Perkins spoke first. 5 years ago, he said, this community made a decision. We decided that Nora Selby was not our responsibility. We decided that an orphan child could take care of herself. We decided that it was acceptable to let a 13-year-old girl dig a hole in a hillside and live or die on her own, because taking her in would be inconvenient, and her parents had died of fever, and she had always been strange. He stopped, composing himself. I was part of that decision. I did not speak against it. I told myself that someone else would help her, that it was not my responsibility, that I had my own family to worry about. I watched her struggle and suffer and nearly die, and I did nothing. He looked at Nora. 3 days ago, I brought my family to her door because we were freezing to death in our own house. I asked her to let us in, to share the shelter that we had mocked for 5 years, to save us from the cold that our proper houses could not keep out. And she did. She opened her door without asking for payment or apology or explanation. She shared her food, her fuel, her home with people who had done nothing to earn her help and everything to earn her contempt. She saved 60 lives, including my children's lives, and she asked for nothing in return. Others spoke. Each confession added to the weight of what had happened. The parents who had not offered to take her in, the merchants who had not given her credit, the women who had followed Prudence Whitfield's lead in shunning her, treating her as a ghost that did not deserve acknowledgement. One by one, they admitted what they had done and what it had cost, not to Nora, but to themselves, the moral debt they had accumulated by abandoning a child and then being saved by the child they abandoned. Prudence Whitfield did not speak. She sat in her pew with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the floor. And when people glanced at her expecting her to contribute to the reckoning, she simply shook her head and remained silent. Her silence was more damning than any confession would have been. It admitted guilt without accepting responsibility, acknowledged wrong without offering amends. When the testimonies were complete, Nora walked to the front of the church. She had not planned to speak. She had nothing prepared, no rehearsed words, no carefully considered message. But they were looking at her, these people who had abandoned her and been saved by her, and she understood that silence would not be enough. My father, she said, dreamed of building an earth-sheltered house. He talked about it sometimes, when we were working together, when he was teaching me about the land and the seasons and the way things grow and die and grow again. He said that the earth was constant, that it held warmth in winter and cool in summer, that a house built into the earth would be easier to heat and easier to cool than a house built on top of the earth. He died before he could build it. My mother died 4 days later, and you decided that I should die too. She looked around the church, meeting the eyes of people who flinched and looked away. I did not die. I dug into the hillside that everyone said was useless, and I built what my father described, and I survived. You called it my grave. For 5 years, every time I came near the settlement, I heard people say that the orphan girl was digging her own grave on the hillside. You expected me to die. Some of you wanted me to die, because my survival was an accusation against your conscience. But I did not die." She paused. "3 days ago, 60 of you came to my grave because your houses were killing you. I let you in because I am not what you tried to make me. I did not learn cruelty from the cruelty you showed me. I did not learn abandonment from being abandoned. My parents raised me to help people who need help, and you needed help, and so I helped you. That is all." She turned to leave, then stopped. "If you want to learn how I built my shelter, I will teach you. The techniques are not secret. The earth is constant everywhere. Any hillside that faces south can hold a home that stays warm in winter with a fraction of the fuel that your wooden houses require. Next winter, every family in Millbrook should have an earth-sheltered room at minimum. The 11 who died because their houses failed them. Build better houses. That is the only apology I want." The construction began that spring. Nora supervised the building of earth-sheltered structures across the Millbrook area, teaching families how to dig into hillsides, how to line the excavations with stone, how to build sod roofs that held warmth and shed water. By winter of 1888, there were 14 earth-sheltered chambers attached to homes in Millbrook, emergency shelters that families could retreat to when the cold exceeded what their wooden houses could handle. The following winters tested these shelters repeatedly, and repeatedly they proved their value. The death toll from cold in Millbrook, which had averaged 2 or 3 people per decade before the blizzard, dropped to 0. The graves that were not graves, the shelters that the earth provided, kept people alive through winters that would have killed them in houses that fought the cold instead of hiding from it. Prudence Whitfield left Millbrook in the spring of 1888. She and her husband sold their store and moved to Omaha, where no one knew that she had led the abandonment of an orphan who had later saved 60 lives. She was never seen in Millbrook again. No one missed her. Nora Selby lived in her earth-sheltered complex for another 47 years, passing in the winter of 1935 at the age of 65. She never married, though she was proposed to several times. She never had children of her own, though she helped raise a generation of Millbrook's children who came to her shelter to learn, to listen to her stories, to sit in the warmth that the earth provided, and understand that survival was not about fighting nature, but about working with it. Her shelter still exists, maintained now by the Nebraska State Historical Society as a monument to frontier survival and the engineering of desperation. Visitors walk through the great room where 60 people sheltered from the schoolhouse blizzard, touch the stone walls that held back the earth, stand in the sleeping alcoves where children huddled against the cold that could not reach them. Above the main entrance, carved into the timber lintel in letters that Nora added in the year after the blizzard, is an inscription that visitors photograph more than anything else in the shelter. It reads, "They called it my grave. It became their salvation." The people who had abandoned her, who had expected her to die, who had crawled to her door begging for the warmth they had mocked, they understood exactly what those words meant. And if you learned something from this story about earth-sheltered construction and the constant temperature of the ground and the determination that allowed one orphan girl to save 60 lives, subscribe to this channel because we have more stories about the forgotten engineering that kept people alive before modern technology made everyone forget how to survive without it. The earth is still constant. The hillsides are still there. The only question is whether we are humble enough to build with them instead of against them.